Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ron Walker. I'm chairman of the Richard Nixon Foundation in Yorba Linda, California, and it's my pleasure to be here this morning. This is the National Archives and the Richard Nixon Foundation, along with the Smithsonian National Museum for American Indians. This is the 24th Richard Nixon Legacy Series that we've held. And we're really happy to be here in this magnificent museum. President Nixon was a special person to me. I spent 5 years working for him and then spent a lot of time with him when he was out of office in the later years. I dedicated his foundation and library, and a year later we buried Mrs. Nixon there, and a year later we buried him. The museum and birthplace is a spectacular place. If you ever have a chance to come, we would welcome you. It is now my pleasure to introduce James Jim Gardner, the Executive for Legislative Archives, Presidential Libraries, and the Museum Services of the National Archives. Jim Gardner. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Ron. On behalf of the National Archives, I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest Nixon Legacy Forum. Richard Nixon and the American Indian, the movement to self-determination. As Ron has mentioned, this is one in a much longer series of programs that we have co-sponsored with the Richard Nixon Foundation. And I want to express our special thanks to everyone here at the National Museum of the American Indian for hosting us in this wonderful building here on the National Mall. I'm relatively new at the archives, having spent the previous decade or so at the Smithsonian, so it's personally nice to be back here on the Mall. The National Archives includes the 12, soon to be 13, libraries of the modern presidents from Hoover forward. In that capacity, we house and maintain the Richard Nixon presidential materials at the Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California. These include the scores of millions of papers, the thousands of hours of tape recordings, and the countless artifacts that make the Nixon administration arguably the most documented presidency in our history. The Nixon Legacy Forums combine two truly unique resources: the Nixon Presidential Papers and Materials, and the Nixon Alumni and Alumni. Many of the men and women who actually created those papers and who helped President Nixon to make the history of those momentous years from 1969 to 1974. These forums provide a fascinating insight into a fascinating time, and we are proud to co-sponsor them with the Nixon Foundation. It is my privilege now to introduce our host this morning, Tim Johnson, Associate Director for Museum Programs here at the National Museum of the American Indian. As Associate Director for Museum Programs, Tim manages a department that encompasses all aspects of the visitor experience, from exhibitions, education, publications, symposia, and lectures, to cultural and performing arts programs. Previously, he served as executive editor of Indian Country Today, where over the course of 6 years, he led the remaking of that publication into the nation's leading American Indian newspaper, noted for its original reporting, analysis, and commentary on matters of American Indian policy and its steadfast defense of American Indian economic interests. Tim.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Glad to be here this morning and filling in for our Director, Kevin Gover, regrettably, who cannot join us today because of a death in his family. On Director Gover's behalf and that of the museum, I welcome you to Richard Nixon and the American Indian, the movement to self-determination. This forum is part of a very active program of seminars and symposia that we have here at the museum, and I invite you to consult our website, nmai.si.edu, for more information about the museum and all our exhibits and programs. I also want to mention that the NMAI, in collaboration with the Smithsonian Books, has published a remarkable volume about the little-known historical relationship of Native leaders and American presidents entitled American Indians, American Presidents. This groundbreaking book, written by 6 scholars of Native American history, is available for sale in our museum shop on the 2nd level of this building. November is Native American Heritage Month, and I think it's particularly appropriate that we are here today to discuss President Richard M. Nixon's important and, for the most part, unknown role in the history of Indians in America. President Nixon's administration is regarded as one of the most pro-Indian of the 20th century, and one that reversed the termination of federal reservations, restored Indian lands to tribes, and ushered in a new era of self-government. Native Americans found a champion in President Nixon, a stance that resulted from his personal history and his consultation with Indian leaders who helped shape the president's view of Indian affairs. This policy breakthrough took place in an atmosphere of Indian activism, even militancy. In a famous incident, a group of Native American activists took over Alcatraz Island in 1969, reclaiming it as Indian land during their 18-month occupation. Amidst this Indian assertion of cultural identity and land claims, President Nixon advanced his successful proposal to repeal termination, and Congress acted on Nixon's reform proposals. In his special message to Congress on July 8, 1970, President Nixon said, "Both as a matter of justice and as a matter of enlightened social policy, we must begin to act on the basis of what the Indians themselves have been long telling us. The time has come to break decisively with the past and to create the conditions for a new era in which the Indian future is determined by Indian acts and Indian decisions." When President Nixon returned the sacred site of Blue Lake in New Mexico to the people of the Taos Pueblo at a ceremony in the East Room of the White House in December 1970, it powerfully symbolized this fundamental shift in U.S. government policy toward American Indian people. At the signing of the legislation, Taos elder Juan de Jesus Romero, speaking in Tiwa, said, "A new day begins not only for the American Indian, but for all the Americans in this country." And indeed, from Richard Nixon's administration through the present day, American presidents have been disposed to view full citizenship and tribal self-determination as the foundation of U.S. Indian policy. We will hear today from our panelists about the key role that President Nixon, members of his administration, contemporaneous Indian leaders, and others played in implementing this historic move to what President Nixon called a new and balanced relationship between the United States government and the first Americans. It is the individuals involved, their motivations, and their points of view that make this material particularly rich and absorbing. For history is not just about ideas, but about particular people and perspectives. Our speakers, especially those who helped formulate and implement this transformation of the federal government's relationship with tribal governments, are uniquely situated to explore this fascinating and important story and bring it vividly to life for us this morning. Now it's my privilege to introduce the moderator of this morning's forum. Wallace Johnson served as Assistant Attorney General for Land and Natural Resources in the Nixon administration. During his tenure there, he created the Indian Rights Litigation Section. Previously, he served as Special Assistant to President Nixon and in several Justice Department and Senate Judiciary Committee assignments. Johnson also serves as a trustee of the Buffalo Bill Historical Center in Cody, Wyoming, which houses the Plains Indian Museum. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Johnson.
And I'll tell you, it's cold in Cody. I talked to my wife out there this morning, and she said it's minus 14 degrees at our ranch. I said, I'm not coming home. My job is to provide an overview for this conversation and introduce the panelists and moderate the conversation. The fact is, I'm sure that our panelists will engage in an active conversation in such a way that you'll forget I'm around. But I do want to provide an overview of what this is all about. This is the third panel discussing essentially the same issue. We had two previous panels at the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa last spring. And basically what we're doing is looking at those presidential papers like historians, but we've got people who were active in developing the concepts of those documents, who actually worked on them, and or who are able to sit back and interpret what they have meant as we examine the last 40 years, looking at the very question that we have posited on the board. 1968 was a turning point. I'm now talking a little bit as a historian, even though I'm a lawyer. It's a turning point because lots of things came together in a very positive way, and lots of things that came together in a very positive way made a real difference. And it's that real difference we want to identify for historians in the future. Now, very much what we're doing is like pulling a tulip apart. Because as we get into this further, we learn more about what we know and what we don't know. And lots of what we don't know will be brought into better focus this morning, but in a way that future historians can examine the tapes of these conversations, the documents that will be developed as part of a research guide, and begin to get a better sense of the significance of actions that were initiated during President Nixon's time. Here's sort of a real short explanation of what happened in those first 4 hours of taping in Tulsa. We know that President Nixon grew up in a very small Quaker enclave in California, and that he went to Whittier, and that at Whittier there was a person that influenced him significantly called Chief Newman. Now, can we point to specific actions that the president took because of his background, his education, his family upbringing? Nope. Anybody that can do that is way better than we are yet today. We have to intuit some of these things. And we know that he oversaw a process with people that developed a pretty meaningful change in historic direction with respect to the former policy of terminating reservations and the future policy of establishing self-determination. Now, and I'm going to be challenging some of the lawyers well, they're all lawyers on our panel, to talk about the nature of sovereignty in the constitutional context, because the tribes are sovereign and yet they're dependent. And what does that mean, and how has it played out in history, and what did it mean back then, 40 years ago, as all of this was under development? So that's what this panel is all about. There's a foundation from those first two discussions. Some of these all three of these panelists are the same, but there are other people who have contributed, all distinguished scholars and public servants. And essentially, we're building on that foundation, but we'll talk a little bit about it too, because we need to bring this panel into perspective because we've learned a lot since then. I am honored to be part of this conversation because I'm dealing with three panelists who are extremely distinguished in their career, and I'm going to briefly introduce them and then turn it over to them, and in their preliminary remarks, ask them to explain in greater detail their backgrounds, because their resumes are so long you can't read them. And I'll at the far end with Professor Bob Anderson. I'm only going to say about Bob that he's a young scholar who is embedded in the Indian movement and basically has the ability to look at the elaboration of history in a very positive way, in a nonpartisan way, even though he was part of a previous Democratic administration. I can't describe Reed Chambers. He calls himself a subaltern to me when we were working together back in the 1970s. Well, thank you. But the fact of the matter is, this guy is a scholar, he's a lawyer, and he has devoted his entire career to representing tribal interests. He's a giant in his field. And I'm leading up, I won't say this is the best, the last is best, but I'll guarantee you, I've never seen a person with such passion as Bobby Kilberg. She started as a White House fellow and grabbed this issue when she was working with John Ehrlichman, and has never let it go, and has had a very distinguished career in government to this very day. But she's also done other things in the technology field, and I'm, as I said, challenging each of them to begin their remarks, for the record, by explaining how they got into this area, basically what they've been doing since, and it'll give us a context for our conversation. Dr. Lee Hubner is not with us. Flu and winter have taken their toll. And there's another fellow who is very instrumental in these panels, Jeff Shepard. He's the person that has organized them for the Nixon Foundation. He's got a cold, couldn't come. He lost his voice. So we're not limited in, we won't be limited in our discussion, but I want to thank those two people who are both not feeling well and can't be with us this morning. Now, use the podium if you want, but when we get to the conversation, we'll just sit over here and talk. And I'd like to call on Bobby, who will start.
Thank you. Good morning. Before I start, there's one more person, actually three people in the audience that need to be recognized. One is sitting over there, is C.D. Ward, who was the Chief of Staff and Counselor to Vice President Agnew and had a critical role in the development of the Indian message. The second is President Nixon's brother, if you will please stand up. He's here to keep us all grounded. And can you all hear me? Yeah. And the third is John Ehrlichman's son, Tom. And Tom, would you please stand up and be recognized? I will, I promise you, get to how I got interested in this as I go through my remarks, but I think it all fits into context. But my role here is really to set the stage on the development of the Indian message and give you a flavor for what went on in the White House, because I think that's very interesting and relevant to how the message came out at the end. President Nixon's July 8th, 1970 message on Indian policy was, as a number of people have said already, historic. In a definitive break from the past, it forcefully committed the United States to a policy of self-determination without termination, and it provided the building blocks to make that policy a reality. Two initial important observations. First, I've been asked literally over and over again over these 42 years, I can't believe it's 42, but it is, what was the origin and the genesis of President Nixon's interest? On September 27, 1968, as the Republican presidential candidate, Nixon had issued a statement to the National Congress of American Indians Convention in Omaha, and that laid out significant points that appeared in his July 8, 1970 message. His July message was much stronger and more comprehensive than the NCI statement, but many of the elements were in that statement. Some commentators say that President Nixon was influenced by an earlier 1968 message from President Johnson that started to review Indian policy. Some think he had read Alvin Josefi's comprehensive memorandum in January 1969 to Jim Kehoe, who was one of his most trusted advisors and director of speechwriting in the White House. But I think, and this was just alluded to, I think there's a simpler and more accurate answer, which is that President Nixon personally held a very strong moral belief that federal Native American policy was destructive, it was discriminatory, it was debilitating, and it simply was not right. Forced assimilation and termination ran really against everything in his moral core. As a young White House fellow, I obviously did not know the president well, but I did get sufficient glimpses of his thought processes to, I think, say with some confidence that he did personalize his beliefs. And in this case, as was just noted, that personalization related to Coach Wallace Newman, his football coach at Whittier College. Coach Newman was a member of the La Jolla Band of the Mission Indian Tribe, and the president said on more than one occasion that the coach had a profound influence on his life and had inspired him and his teammates to be self-confident, competitive, and to never give up. Now, if you go back to those days, that was a long time ago, the president felt that Coach Newman had never given up, even though he was really very much discriminated against. That was a time when Native Americans and other minorities simply were not selected as coaches for major football programs, rather than, with all due respect to Whittier's program, nor were they selected to be major coaches as players or receive major honors as players. And the president believed that Coach Newman would have been an All-American if it had been a different time, and then he would have been a coach at a Big Ten school if it had been a different time. But that was just not possible in those days. Nixon thought it was terribly unfair, and I heard him say more than once that he promised himself that if he had ever had the chance, he would correct the wrongs against Native Americans on behalf of Coach Newman. I think that the July 8th Indian message was part payback for Coach Newman. It also was consistent with the president's belief that you provide opportunity for everyone, but you don't force everyone into the same mold. For example, his strong federal financial support for historically black colleges fit that same pattern: self-determination and opportunity without forced assimilation. President Johnson's 1968 Indian message did mention the concept of self-determination and some contracting out. The establishment of the National Council on Indian Opportunity was important. Josefi's memo, Bill Veter's views, if some of you remember Bill Veter's views on the trust responsibility, the Senate Subcommittee on Indian Education report from Teddy Kennedy, Edgar Kahn's Our Brother's Keeper, and the new OEO's open approach to working with Indian tribes and communities all provided a context within this framework for the president's message. The second important observation, and this is very important, President Nixon had a very top-down management style, and John Ehrlichman, as assistant to the president for domestic affairs, was head of domestic policy, period, end of conversation. Thus, everything that went up from John and everything came down from John. We will never know how much of the specific policy initiatives were really John's and how much were the president's personally. But it really didn't matter because John Ehrlichman had the authority to speak for the president, and he did so. And appropriately, he never let you know anything more than that. Thus, we need to give John Ehrlichman major credit for the president's Indian message and policy because he was integral to it, he was central to it, he was the central decision maker. Now, let's turn to how that message came about. It was October 1969, and this is somewhat about how I got interested, Wally. It was 7:30 a.m., and at 7:30 a.m., as Ron Walker knows, was the White House senior staff meetings. Now, I attended that not because I was a member of the White House senior staff. I was a 23-year-old White House fellow. But because I was a White House fellow, I was given that privilege. Now, I normally sat on the side of the room and not around the table. The real senior staffers, Len Garment, John Ehrlichman, were at the table. And that morning, John opened the meeting by saying that the president had talked with him and wanted a thorough review of federal Indian policy, and that he was not pleased with the present state of affairs. John also noted the Vice President Agnew, under C.D. Ward, had addressed NCEI's October 8th convention in Albuquerque to begin to set the stage. So John then looked at everybody in the room and said, okay, anybody have an expertise in this area? And there was just eerie silence. And I hesitated for a while because I was supposed to be a backbencher, but when no one else volunteered, I raised my hand. I said, I went to Yale Law School, and some people say, well, that explains all you need to know, right? That's an inside joke among lawyers. But anyway, that I went to Yale Law School, and that my thesis at Yale Law School had been on community control of Indian education, and that I'd spend about 3 weeks on the Navajo Reservation my senior year with some of my colleagues from Yale who had already graduated, working on an education lawsuit against the BIA that was brought by DNA, which was the first legal services OEO program on an Indian reservation. And we'd done that on behalf of the Chinle Navajo chapter. Well, that was about all I guess anybody needed, so I was drafted. And John asked Len Garment to work as a senior advisor counselor on the project and instructed all of us to work with C.D. Ward and the vice president. And Len assigned Brad Patterson, his executive assistant, to work with me. So one of the first steps we took was to consult with Bob Robertson, who was director of the National Council of Indian Opportunity, NCIO, which reported to Vice President Agnew. NCIO had been established by an executive order by President Johnson in his March 6, 1968 message. It was chaired by the Vice President, and this is an interesting list of people who were on this council. The Secretaries of Interior, HEW, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, and HUD, the Director of OEO, and 6 Indian leaders who were appointed by the President for terms of 2 years. In August 1970, President Nixon expanded the council by executive order to include the Attorney General, who should have been on it from the beginning, plus 2 additional Indian leaders for a total of 8. NCIO had already started a series of 8 public regional forums on Indian issues and programs around the country, seeking both reservation and urban Indian input, and building in part on President Johnson's 1968 message. Their goal was to prepare a set of recommendations for consideration by President Nixon, and we welcomed that input vehicle. On January 26, 1970, Vice President Agnew held a meeting of the Cabinet and Indian members of NCIO in the West Wing of the White House in the Roosevelt Room. In attendance were, and again, this is very relevant, these were really heavy hitters. In attendance were the Vice President, the 6 Indian members of the Council, Interior Secretary Hickel, HEW Secretary Finch, Labor Secretary Schultz, Agriculture Secretary Hardin, Commerce Secretary Stans, HUD Secretary Romney, and OEO Director Rumsfeld, as well as Len Garment, Bob Robertson, C.D. Ward, as policy advisor to the Vice President, Brad Patterson, and me. The 6 Indian members were appointees of President Johnson since they had 2-year terms, and they were obviously there as well. Bob Robertson and the Indian members of the council presented the findings from their regional forums and a set of recommendations for consideration by the council. LaDonna Harris, a Comanche from Oklahoma, had been chosen to speak on behalf of the Indian members. And when she spoke, it literally was so moving and powerful and charismatic that the room was literally spellbound. It was really something to see. We took the NCI draft recommendations and we circulated them formally to each cabinet member on the council, which was standard White House procedure, as well as to the Attorney General, who wasn't on it at that time, and the director of the new Office of Management and Budget. And these officials sent the recommendations to their senior department executives for their review and comment. The Vice President, by the way, through C.D. Ward, was a big supporter of many of the proposed initiatives, a lot of them. We held many subsequent meetings, especially with Interior, OMB, Justice, HEW, and OEO, to massage, strengthen, alter, and finalize the recommendations. In these recommendations, self-determination took central stage, as did rejecting termination and repealing House Concurrent Resolution 108. And further recommendations included the right to control and operate federal programs through contracts, education reform, including the right of Indian communities to control their own schools, economic development legislation, including broadening the revolving loan fund, providing providing loan guarantees, and permitting long-term tribal leasing of lands. Additional resources for Indian health and urban Indian programs, the establishment, very importantly, of an independent Indian Trust Council Authority, which in the long term did not pass the Congress, the creation of an Interior Department Assistant Secretary for Indian and Territorial Affairs, and the return of Blue Lake to the Taos Pueblo people. We had major confrontations with Justice and OMB over the Trust Council Authority and contracting, and with OMB and Agriculture over Blue Lake. We had support on most issues from Interior Secretary Hickel, who was particularly strong on the need for an independent Trust Council Authority, while the Vice President preferred a Trust Council within the Interior Department. We also worked closely with Don Rumsfeld and his deputy Frank Carlucci at OEO, who were very supportive, and on occasion we had helpful input from Pat Moynihan, who was Counselor to the President for Urban Affairs. President Nixon had approved support for the return of Blue Lake in late January, and we decided to separate out the Alaska Native Lands Claim issue, which was the other big land issue, from the message because of its complexity and sensitivity and because it was not yet ready for prime time. However, please note that when President Nixon made his decision on Alaska Native land claims in 1971, he supported a settlement of 40 million acres of land, almost $1 billion in cash, and the creation of 13 Native regional corporations. I give credit for this to both the President and John Ehrlichman, who controlled access to the President on this issue and reported the President's decision. No cabinet member challenged John's conclusion. After 3 months, going back to the Indian message, after 3 months of negotiating within the federal branch and having discussions with the Indian community, both through NCIO and through other organizations such as NCAI, we presented a decision memorandum for the President in late April, which was signed by Vice President Agnew. Now, the process of decision memos was very interesting, and John Ehrlichman always wanted to be sure that when something was ready to go to the President, it was really ready to go to the President. John, therefore, reviewed the memo with me and sent it back with lots of notes and notations and comments. He sent it back for better development of major proposals, including the Indian right to control or operate federal programs through contracting, the Indian Trust Council Authority, and Indian control of Indian schools. After additional review, Len Garment, Brad Patterson, C.D. Ward, and I redrafted a memorandum for the President dated June 13th. John Ehrlichman again reviewed the memorandum with me and sent it back again for another round of discussions on a number of issues. About a week later, a final memorandum for the President was prepared. It received John's final approval and was sent into President Nixon under Len Garment's signature. Now remember, the initial memo was done under the Vice President's signature, and the end memo was done under Len Garment's signature, but it was really a cumulative effort. As the above scenario indicates, John Ehrlichman had been the decision broker of every major aspect of policy, with Len Garment and C.D. Ward through Brad Patterson providing advice and counsel. I had the privilege of being the facilitator, I think. Thus, when the decision memo went into the Oval Office, John basically knew that it would come out intact, and indeed it did. To my knowledge, there never was an actual meeting between President Nixon and all the federal government stakeholders on our Indian policy proposals. President Nixon worked solely through John Ehrlichman, who would convey back to our working groups the President's ideas and concerns. For example, I remember vividly John telling me that the President was adamant that we would be absolutely certain that no one in the Indian community would view self-determination as a disguise for termination, nor would worry that somehow tribal authority would be turned over to the states. One of the hallmarks, if you all may remember, of the Nixon presidency was the new federalism. But the President made it very clear that any application of federalism had to fit within the overarching rubric of adherence to the nation's treaty and trust responsibilities and respect for Indian sovereignty. There still remained a great deal of work to be done once President Nixon approved the concepts and specific policy initiatives and negotiations, and arguments over specifics continued right up until the release of the President's message on July 8th. For example, and this may be addressed later by Reed and others, for example, we released the message without having an Indian Trust Council Authority bill actually approved. Darrell McKittrick and Don Crable at OMB opposed the measure, and they convinced Assistant Secretary Don Rice that it was a bad idea fraught with unintended consequences. We had similar problems with the contracting out legislation, but that was in better shape by July 8th. that gives you kind of a flavor of where we were and how we got to the message. But how it was presented to the American public, I think, is very important as well. And I really cannot conclude without spending a few minutes to describe the president's Blue Lake decision to you and how much he was really emotionally invested in it, because it is a side of Richard Nixon that is rarely reported on or chronicled. It is a very human and caring side of the president's nature, and I really think it's our duty to have it recorded for history. Also, the way the Blue Lake decision unfolded affected in a major way the rollout aspects of the presidential message, changing it from a fact sheet to a message, presenting it at a cabinet room event, and providing visuals for first page, above the fold, coverage in the New York Times with the whole full message printed inside the paper. The senior White House staff, other than John Ehrlichman and Len Garman and C.D. Ward, who understood, but the rest of the staff, they were absolutely totally surprised, and I think they were actually floored. President Nixon had never received such favorable press. The focus by the media and the American public on the India message would never have happened but for some drama relating to Blue Lake in the White House, and I will need to share that with you. In restoring the sacred Blue Lake and its surrounding watershed lands, 48,000 acres, to the Taos Pueblo people, President Nixon righted a wrong that was then 64 years old. It was a defining moment in Native American relations with the federal government. As I noted earlier, in March, the president had decided to support the return to Blue Lake and make it part of his Indian policy, which would be announced at a later date. Thus, no prior notification of his support had been made. It's now late June, and due to a pressing and crowded schedule, the Indian message is scheduled to be released as a fact sheet, but not with an accompanying event. So there I am. I'm carrying about 100 copies. In those days, there was no emails, et cetera, et cetera. You literally almost mimeographed. I can't remember. You mimeographed on these big machines these copies of stuff. And, I remember spending all 4th of July weekend, to my husband's distress, sitting there Xeroxing these things. So I'm carrying about 100 copies of the fact sheet press release down an incline from the West Wing to the White House press briefing room to give it to reporters as it's released, when out of nowhere, I literally get tackled by the White House Director of Senate Relations named Ken Ballou. I got tackled with such force that I was knocked down, and all these messages go flying around outside the press room. And as Ken helps me up, he declares that the Indian message cannot and will not be released. And I was a bit incredulous and a little hurt, and I said, why? And he said, well, it's very simple. New Mexico Senator Clinton Anderson opposes the return to Blue Lake, and he is threatening to vote, no joke, he's threatening to vote against the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the ABM Treaty, if the president does not remove Blue Lake from the message. So I took a deep breath, and my response was to say, Ken, let's go upstairs and let's meet with John Ehrlichman. And John listened to him, and then he called the president's secretary, Rose Woods, and he said he needed to come to the Oval Office to talk with the president about an important matter. So John and Ken proceeded to the Oval Office. I was a young staffer. I was not permitted to go into the Oval Office, so I waited very anxiously in the anteroom. And what seemed, I think, literally like forever, but eventually the Oval Office door opened, and honest, I thought the president winked at me. That was very unusual, to say the least. I looked at Ehrlichman, and I looked at Ken Ballou, and I asked what happened. And John was smiling broadly. He had this big, chubby face. He was smiling broadly. And Ken Ballou looked like a bus had run over him. The president had instructed Ken Ballou to tell Senator Anderson that his decision stands, and that if Anderson does not like it, he can vote against the ABM, and he can go, and I can't say this in mixed company, the 4-letter word himself. Honest, he did. And what is more, Ehrlichman said to me, we're going to invite the Taos Pueblo people to the White House to release our India message as a presidential message in front of the Taos delegation and declare the president's strong and firm support for the return to Blue Lake. So on July 8, 1970, President Nixon indeed did meet with a delegation of Taos Pueblo leaders in the cabinet room with the Vice President, Interior Secretary Hickel, HEW Secretary Richardson, OEO Director Rumsfeld, Len Garment, and John Ehrlichman. Also included were the President and Vice President of NCAI, who were new members of NCIO, and C.D. Ward and I were present as well. Meeting in the cabinet room was really a unique honor, since it's almost exclusively reserved, or back then it was almost exclusively reserved for meetings with the cabinet, governors, congressional leaders, and delegations of foreign heads of state. This was the first time in the Nixon White House that anyone other than those designated folks had been invited to meet in that room with the president. It was a recognition by the president of tribal sovereignty and his respect. After President Nixon's India message received widespread and featured coverage in the press, the Blue Lake effort really came front and center with a bipartisan effort led by Senator Fred Harris, a Democrat from Oklahoma, his wife LaDonna Harris, head of Americans for Indian Opportunity, and the Republican president. What an odd, very odd, but effective trio they were. And they found help in Democratic Senators Edward Kennedy and George McGovern, and Republican Senators Bob Griffin and Mac Mathias. President Nixon personally lobbied selected members of the Senate, including the key vote, which was Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, as did John Ehrlichman, Len Garman, C.D. Ward, Brad, and myself. And on December 2nd, 1970, the Senate approved the Blue Lake legislation by a 70-12 vote. This vote was amazing, and the vote spread, frankly, was a surprise to us because the legislation had been rejected by the Senate Interior and Insular Affairs Committee, and this was the first time that a Senate committee vote had been overturned by the full Senate. Now, those of you who spend any time in the Senate know that it used to be at least a place of great decorum. I don't know if it still is, but sitting in the U.S. Senate gallery to watch the vote were the Taos Cacique, the Pueblo governor, the tribal secretary Paul Bernal, other delegation members, their lawyers and community supporters, LaDonna Harris, Brad Patterson, C.D. Ward, and me. Now, in the Senate gallery, visitors are never supposed to stand up, never supposed to make noise, and never supposed to applaud. But the cacique, and I can still cry when I think of this, the cacique had brought with him two canes, one cane that President Lincoln had given to the Pueblo, and one cane that President Nixon had given to us when we went out to the Pueblo in July 1970 as a White House delegation. And both canes were to honor the Taos Pueblo people. And the cacique stood up in the Senate gallery, and he held those two canes aloft, and the entire gallery stood up. And then all the senators stood up from their chairs and looked at the gallery, and they started to applaud. The gallery started to applaud. The entire Senate chamber erupted. No one had ever seen anything like that. It was an extraordinarily moving moment. And then finally, on December 15th, 1970, as a 24-year-old young lawyer, I was in charge of the Blue Lake bill signing ceremony in the East Room of the White House. President Nixon sat at the signing table with the cacique and the tribal secretary Paul Bernal standing next to him, and the room was just overflowing with attendees. The president asked the cacique to start with a prayer, and the room, which was beautifully decorated for Christmas holidays, came exquisitely silent, and Paul Bernal translated the cacique's prayer. And then the cacique thanked the president for his unwavering support, and Paul translated again. And then this went on, and both their remarks went on for a very long time. And then the president stood, and he spoke, and finally he sat down, and he took his pen in hand, and he signed into law the return of Blue Lake to Taos Pueblo. As a young staffer, I had never spent any personal time with the president, but after the event, he invited me to walk with him to his motorcade. And the ceremony had gone on way over schedule, and he was late for a speech before the employees of HUD. And he seemed to be in a real rush to get to his car, so I apologized for the ceremony taking so long. Well, the president turned, and he stared directly at me, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "Young lady, this ceremony was one of the highlights of my presidency. It was absolutely a beautiful time, and I wish it could only have continued longer. I'm very proud of what we did today." And I want you all to know that I'm very proud of President Richard Nixon. And thank you for allowing us to share our remembrances today.
Bobby, you're always a hard act to follow, but particularly today. I'm Reed Chambers. I served as the chief Indian lawyer at the Interior Department between 1973 and 1976. Since then, I've been practicing law here with a small law firm in Washington, D.C., Sonosky, Chambers, Saxe, Anderson, and Perry. My partner, Doug Anderson, a Navajo Indian, is here today at this meeting. So my whole career, as Wally says, has been basically involved in Indian law and representing tribal interests. Before I joined the Interior Department, I had been a professor at UCLA Law School, and in that capacity I taught federal Indian law and also worked with the legal service organizations, particularly California Indian Legal Services and the Native American Rights Fund, in bringing some of the initial law reform cases that were brought pretty much at the same time as the Nixon message. What I want to talk to you, I guess I should say, let me say one other thing. Wally, I remarked last week that I had been a subaltern to Wally Johnson, and what I meant by that is that Wally was the Assistant Attorney General in the Division of the Justice Department handling Indian cases. He had been appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. Associate solicitors didn't have to go through that. And also my boss at the Interior Department, the solicitor, which is the general counsel of the department, Kent Frizzell, is a presidential appointment and confirmed by the Senate. And I guess together I saw them as the real giants in implementing the Nixon Indian policy as a legal matter, and in that sense I was an assistant to Kent. In practicing law in Washington, I've noticed over the years a lot of policies announced. And a certain amount of fanfare, perhaps almost nothing as dramatic as Bobby's describing with this one. And then they wither on the vine often because they're not implemented. But where I want to give credit to Wally and to Kent Frizzell, who was in our Tulsa meeting but not here today, is that they really were determined to implement the Nixon Indian policy. And I think one reason it has become the standard for all administrations since, Republican and Democratic, bipartisan Indian policy that has been really sometimes more robustly, sometimes less robustly implemented, but has been the basic policy of other presidential orders since then. Is that it was so actively implemented. So one thing perhaps in the discussion period, we get a chance for Wally to give a personal reflection on why this was an important thing for him, because, you know, you could imagine, and it's quite frequent, that you have the president announce a policy or message, but down at the assistant secretary or assistant attorney general level or the solicitor level, the person in that job's more interested in other things. They don't get in the way of the policy. They don't go out and actively implement it. Wally did. Kent did in hiring me and directing me that I was to go out and serve exclusively as the lawyer advocate for reasonable Indian legal claims within the both in terms of bringing litigation and referring cases over to justice, and in terms of all the conflicts within the Interior Department. Because there are a lot of agencies, and President Nixon recognized this in his message, that there are a lot of conflicts between the trust responsibility of the United States to protect the rights to resources of Indian tribes, to water, to land, to rights to hunt and fish, and the programs and responsibilities of other bureaus within the Interior Department. The Fish and Wildlife Service, protecting and conserving fish and wildlife. The Bureau of Reclamation, which for decades had been building water projects to provide irrigation water and municipal water to non-Indians, really water that the Indians had a reasonable claim to. The Bureau of Land Management and the Park Service are major landholding agencies, often having conflicts with Indian claims to land. President Nixon's message recognized that the Indians were frequently the losers when these conflicts arose. Well, Kent charged me with only representing Indian interests, not taking into account other issues or responsibilities in the department, and also to bring to his attention, and the Secretary of the Interior by that time was Rogers Morton, the Secretary's attention, situations where there were administrative conflicts, and to advocate the Indian position. We did that, and we began to bring a number of cases protecting Indian fishing rights in the state of Washington, which went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and where the rights were vindicated. Oregon, where, among other things, we supported the hunting and fishing rights of a tribe that had been terminated in the 1950s and later was restored to federal Indian tribal status, the Klamath tribe. Cases in Minnesota and Michigan particularly, and Wisconsin, where we were supporting off-reservation fishing rights and the rights of Indians to exercise hunting and fishing rights without being subject to state regulation. Those cases were largely successful. As we sent an increasing number of cases over to Wally's division, two things happened. Wally generally there may have been one or two you didn't file, but I can't recall them as I'm sitting here now, that Wally accepted our recommendations. Some of these cases were politically controversial. We were suing thousands of non-Indian water users in the Pyramid Lake case, or in the Pueblo case in New Mexico. We were suing, on the other side of the fishing cases were state agencies, and again, thousands of sports fishermen and major commercial fishing interests. Wally, you invariably filed those cases, and not just filed them, but prosecuted them energetically. That about a year after I was in the job, Wally called me and told me he was going to establish a separate section in the Justice Department to try those cases, where the lawyers would be experts in Indian affairs, and where they would only handle cases where the United States was suing as a trustee for Indian tribes. That section still exists today. It's a lasting legacy nearly 4 decades later. Bobby mentioned the Indian Trust Council proposal, that the idea had been in the Nixon message to take these issues out of the Interior and Justice Departments and set up a separate agency that would represent the trust responsibility of the United States. It would be outside the Interior and Justice Departments. That legislation was never enacted, I think in part because Indian leaders became concerned about whether relieving Justice and Interior of any trust responsibilities was a wise thing to do, and worried about setting up a separate agency. So that wasn't established, but Wally's section in the Justice Department, that's still the Indian Rights section, that still exists, and Kent's mandate to me to serve within the Interior Department exclusively as a trustee were major accomplishments, I think, institutionally, and I think set a template for future solicitors of the Interior Department, future Assistant Attorney Generals. Bob served in the Clinton administration in the chair I sat in as the Chief Indian Lawyer, the Associate Solicitor for Indian Affairs. And I think he will bring forward in his comments the longevity of the Nixon policy. Certainly, future solicitors had a model that Kent set. Greg Austin, his successor, followed. Peter Taft, Wally's successor, followed. In the Justice Department that I think does serve as a template for future administrations and has served that way. I want to talk about two other things on the aspects of this. well, I guess I've mentioned the separate section in the Justice Department. I want to talk a little bit about the extraordinarily strong support I had in the 3 years I served in government from the White House. I didn't, John Ehrlichman was no longer in the White House when I joined the government, so I didn't get to work with him. I'm pleased his son is here today, and Bobby has certainly talked about the enormous influence he had on the Indian policy. And that's what I had understood also from my friends who were tribal attorneys in the Seattle area who knew Mr. Ehrlichman before he joined the government, that he'd been supportive out there of what were very controversial fishing rights issues. But Brad Patterson and Len Garment and Bobby Kilberg, particularly when you came back in the Ford, you became more active in this in the Ford administration, and Dr. Ted Mars also, were high-level officials in the White House. Len Garment, basically, as I recall, was one of the top officials in the White House at that time. They were interested in Indian affairs. They'd been involved in doing the Indian policy. And when tensions came up, when other agencies of the government didn't want to follow the Indian policy, they would call meetings and coordinate the policy and make sure it was followed. And I think that was I think that it was somewhat unique in the Nixon and Ford White Houses that people at that level of the White House senior staff, and with the stature that Bobby had in having been involved in putting the message together. We had some issues in the Ford administration about whether it would continue to be adhered to, and I can remember particularly on the split brief policy. That was a policy where actually this was unique in the Nixon and Ford administrations, wasn't followed afterwards. Griffin Bell cut it out, but where when he was Attorney General with Carter. But the policy was that if there was an Indian trust issue in a case and the Justice Department was filing a brief on behalf of the Corps of Engineers or the Internal Revenue Service on that issue, going against resolve the issue against the Indian trust rights, the Solicitor of the Interior Department could file a section in that brief stating the separate views of the solicitor as trustee. We filed 6 split briefs. A few of them were done before my time. Most of them were ones that I authored. And we won all 6 cases. So it was a strong support of Indian rights. That there came a time when the Assistant Attorney General for the Tax Division in Justice didn't want to file a split brief in a case, and took the matter up with the White House, I think with the counsel, Philip Buchan for President Ford. Bobby and Brad were very active in continuing the split brief policy, and it was continued. So I think I'll close now. I mean, that gives the idea of at least a broad sense of how the policy was implemented during the Nixon and Ford administrations. And Bob, I hope you can bring it up to date. Thanks.
Thank you, Reed, Bobby, Wally. Thanks to the museum for having us here. It's great to be here. I want to bring some of these themes that have been brought out up to the current time, and many of these issues are still in play and will be in play for many, many years. It's going to be people like me and others who are going to follow me as well, who are going to have to continue to grapple with some of these issues that fortunately received excellent treatment in the Nixon administration and really got off to a good start. And it really is a legacy to be proud of. As Reed mentioned, I served in the Clinton administration as the Associate Solicitor for Indian Affairs. I got into Indian law through my work at the Native American Rights Fund back in the early and mid-'80s. I had grown up in northern Minnesota as a member of the Boys Fort Band of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, right up on the Canadian border, and was, interested in Indian affairs as I observed the events that Bobby was involved in the early '70s at the White House when I was just a young kid. And when I met Charles Wilkinson in law school, he encouraged me to go to work for NARF, where Reed had worked, and I went there as a law clerk. Met Doug Enderson, who's in the audience here, and had the privilege of working with him and other great lawyers at NARF. And, spent about a dozen years there, and then got into the Alaska issues when we opened an Alaska office. So I want to talk a little bit about what a good settlement that was in terms of land and money, but the shortcomings that have been revealed in the modern era, and there's always more work to be done. And so after 6 years working for Secretary Babbitt and John Leshy, I found myself teaching at the University of Washington, and now every year I traipse out to Harvard for one term to teach Indian law, and so I find I'm teaching it a couple times a year and looking at it anew from a broader perspective. And I can't say enough about this this new federalism idea of self-determination and self-governance, and what a tremendous impact that has had in terms of tribal governments taking over programs operated previously by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and administering them at the tribal level. Sometimes individual tribes exclusively, sometimes regional consortia, but it has really empowered tribal political leaders to have a real say-so in terms of how these programs are administered. The self-determination policy announced by President Nixon has grown into a block grant program in many respects with the self-governance programs that are in place today, so that tribes, like states, receive federal funds and allocate them as they see fit in accordance with tribal needs and political priorities. And that's a critical and positive component of modern Indian affairs. Remember that in 1968, 1969, we were just coming out of the termination era. There were many Supreme Court cases from the 19th and 20th centuries recognizing the pre-constitutional sovereign status of Indian nations, but most of the work that Congress had done during the time was about asserting control over Indian affairs and achieving cessions of Indian lands, and in the 50s, outright termination of the federal-tribal relationship. And so we had a brief respite with the Indian Reorganization Act in the 30s and 40s, but the most significant aspect of federal Indian policy up until the late 60s had been the suppression of Indian tribal governments and efforts at assimilation, as well as federal acquisition of tribal lands for dispersal among the states and those who moved to the West. And so this reversal in policy was really dramatic, and I mentioned the self-determination, self-governance aspects of it. The notion of returning tribal lands that comes out of the Blue Lake action has really been tremendous as well, and it's been something that hasn't been followed consistently as many tribes would like, but it has been a major part of legislation involving settlement of water rights cases, for example, that many of which were commenced during the Nixon and Ford administrations, and aggressive patterns for federal litigation on behalf of tribes that were developed in that era hold to this day. I think of the Reed's mention of the Pyramid Lake case, where the government asserted water rights for fisheries habitat protection in the 70s. Well, that legal theory has maintained a status as a centerpiece of every administration that's come since then, Republican and Democratic. In the United States, has filed lawsuits on behalf of tribes and will continue to do so, I have no doubt, because of the fact that lawyers for Indian tribes now who have represented them for many years can point to the fact that, look, this is not a controversial position. This was developed in the Nixon years. It was adhered to in the Reagan years, in the Carter years, under both Bushes and in the Clinton and Obama administration. So these sorts of things were really solid decisions that have maintained great importance coming forward. This notion that Reed mentioned of a trust council and the conflicts of interest within the department also persists to this day. The landmark Cobell litigation involving claims by individual Indian allottees against the United States has resulted in a $3.4 billion settlement for past accounting claims. That settlement is nearly finalized, and the current administration is looking forward. How can we avoid these sorts of problems in the future? And to that end, Secretary Salazar has put me and 4 others on a National Commission on Trust Reform. And it's amazing to work with Bobby and Reed and Wally and look at these papers from the 70s and see the great ideas that are there that maybe need to be tweaked, taken a little viewed in a little more of a nuanced fashion, but this idea of a split brief, of informing a court that there is an honest dispute between and within the government on the Indian side of a legal issue and on the Corps of Engineers or Department of Agriculture or Internal Revenue Services position is something that courts should be aware of. After all, court systems are there to do justice. And when there is a fair argument and the United States has this internal conflict, courts should be made aware of that. Now, it's a tougher nut to crack when you talk about the internal battles within the Interior Department. You've got the Bureau of Reclamation, the Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, sometimes working in concert with the views of and positions of the Indian tribes and the Indian Affairs Division, sometimes in opposition. And much of that, the resolution of those sorts of conflicts depends on the attitude of the solicitor and the Secretary of the Interior. But equally important is whether or not those folks feel that somebody at the White House who's important in a policy-making capacity is very interested in these things and wants the issues to turn out in favor of tribal interests whenever possible. And that sort of a tone, I think the Nixon administration has probably been unrivaled in terms of having key people who are very high up in the administration, very knowledgeable and very concerned about ensuring that the positions coming out of Interior and other cabinet agencies affecting Indian issues come out most often in ways beneficial and in concert with tribal issues. I've got about 500 things on here, but I want to sit down. One thing that makes us remember other things about the Nixon administration is, the environmental statutes that were passed by Congress during that era, and the treatment that Indian tribes have received, maybe not initially, but since then, as in these statutes. So the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act have been amended or administratively interpreted at various times to provide for tribes to implement those federal statutes, just as states have the authority to do so. And now virtually all of the environmental laws that Congress has passed include provisions equating tribes with the authority that is delegated to other governments, the other sovereign states, so that tribes may administer those programs as well if they choose to do so. The water rights cases that were commenced, I mentioned in-stream flows, but the many others have dragged on for years and years. Now we've had 29 settlements of Indian water rights cases approved by Congress, and many others in the works. And it's because the Justice Department staked out an aggressive and well-informed litigation strategy. And the Indian resources section of the Justice Department remains very important and key to advocating for tribes within the Justice Department and working with Interior to ensure adequate representation. The Native Claims Settlement Act, tremendous in the final decision to provide and recognize ultimately 45 million acres of land have passed to Alaska Native corporations, both regional and village corporations, $1 billion in funding, many amendments to tweak the federal legislation to assist the corporations in surviving. Some are thriving. Others have more troubles, especially some of the smaller ones. But what was not considered at the time and adequately dealt with was the issue of sovereignty in Alaska. So you've got 226 tribes that are recognized in Alaska. The Supreme Court ruled that ANCSA extinguished the Indian country status of those villages when it was passed, although it didn't say that on the face of the statute. And so while tribes have governmental status and power over internal tribal matters like domestic relations and so on, the powers that we associate with tribes throughout the United States, the routine municipal powers over lands and people that all governments enjoy are not recognized in Alaska. Secondly, the issue of hunting and fishing and gathering rights was not dealt with by the Settlement Act. Congress expressed a desire that it be dealt with by existing administrative authorities. That didn't happen. A statutory substitute, not a native preference, but a rural preference was passed in 1980. That too has proved inadequate, and I know there's a great deal of discussion always in Alaska from the native side of the issues about how to repair the damage that was done in those two specific areas. So ongoing work for everyone. The final thing that I'll touch on here is sort of a brighter side of the coin, and that is the Public Law 280 litigation that was brought involving Bryan v. Itasca County, which made it clear that states didn't have regulatory authority granted to them when this Public Law 280 was passed in 1953 and transferred to states some federal criminal jurisdiction and the authority to have some civil authority within Indian country. Well, the Supreme Court adopted the legal theory developed by the Justice Department and Interior in the early 70s and struck down Minnesota's attempt to tax an individual's personal property on a reservation in Minnesota. That case was followed by what we call the Cabazon ban case involving bingo in California, and that in turn led to the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which has resulted in the gaming industry, which has been, a phenomenal economic development tool within Indian country and allowed tremendous economic diversification to take place on many reservations, not all. And again, that's based on this Bryan case, this legal theory that was developed. So a lot of great work was done. Much remains to be done, but it really has had a lasting effect and a positive lasting effect on the work that tribal attorneys and government lawyers do now on behalf of Indian tribes. So I'll sit down now.
Reed, do you have a watch?
I do, Wally. We have
Quarter
14
12,
minutes.
45 minutes.
But,
Okay.
Do we have till 12:30 or 12?
Yes,
Yeah.
12:30.
Okay.
Let me add a few comments and then turn it over to you three again. Bobby and Reed and Bob all alluded to some documents. Now I'm talking for the record and to future historians because as Ron has pointed out, our job here is basically to provide oral history that will support an analysis of documents in the National Archives and aid researchers in the future. There are documents. And I wish that Professor Hubner did not have the flu, because he wrote the message. And we've been able to develop a chronological presentation about the development of the message. Bobby talked about a memo. These are wonderful documents for researchers. And I want to be sure that whoever happens to watch this in the future knows about those documents. And Bob Anderson is going to be doing a research guide that will include references to them so that we can tie together the archival material, the oral conversation, and the materials in a way that researchers can use to analyze what happened then now.
And Wally, you know, there are 3 memos for the president. One by the vice president, one interim one that was building on the vice president's one, and then the third and final one, all of which went through John and then back out.
Yeah,
but there are 3 of those that researchers should look at, and there are at least 3 different drafts of the message, plus the statement that the president then, as Republican candidate, sent to NCAI in 1968. So there's a trove of data there.
It's a treasure trove of material for a historian. And it's developed since we had the sessions down in Tulsa. The second preliminary observation, and then we'll let it go for a while, in conversation. I heard Bobby say in Tulsa that the president said to her words to the effect, do the right thing. Now, when you look at the complex relationship that exists within a government to implement a policy, knowing what the right thing to do is not a perfectly simple thing. And I think what President Nixon did through his policy and action and with the people who developed and then implemented this policy was to do the right thing. Now, it could have been that moment in history. In other words, it's very hard to understand because there are so many foundation documents and events that went into developing the message. But I was reminded as I listened to the 3 of you that what we tried to do was the right thing. Now, here's why it gets tough. And I'm saying this again for people who may not understand the complexity of our government. The United States Department of Justice, one of the original departments, basically treasures its relationship with the courts, and when it speaks for the United States, it speaks for the United States. What's that mean? Well, when you tell me, when you explain that to me, I'll be quite happy. Because as Reed and Bob pointed out, even deciding within a department what its position and reference will be when it sends a case to the Department of Justice isn't a simple thing. So when I became Assistant Attorney General in 1973, and I was Assistant Attorney General through 1975, basically the United States Code is divided among the various divisions of the department, and they all have responsibility for some part of the United States laws. The problem is that the attorney that may be handling a Bureau of Land Management referral or a Bureau of Indian Affairs referral sit in the same office. Made little sense to me, and working with Kent Frizzell, who was solicitor then, we worked it out so that this office was established that was committed to the right thing. Now, I say that as a predicate, but the bigger issue goes back, I think, to the, and I'm now throwing a question to you 3 to chew on for a while. What was the status of the tribes? Because we were faced with a situation where they were sovereign, but they weren't. And historically, how did we find our way to a point where President Nixon and his team were able to reshape the direction of national policy toward treatment of this sovereign people, these sovereign peoples? I don't care who starts.
Well, Wally, I'll take a crack at it. There is no, I mean, maybe there's no absolute sovereignty at all in our system of government. I mean, the United States, of course, under the Supremacy Clause in the Constitution, trumps the states in any matter where the United States has authority, but there's some issues that the United States just doesn't have authority in. Similarly, state law can be preempted by federal law, so states don't have absolute sovereignty. And tribes do have the courts have held, have a dependent status as sovereigns, but they do have the right to be a distinct political society. The early cases by Chief Justice Marshall say that. I think what the Nixon message, and it had precursors in the Office of Economic Opportunity that Bobby was talking about, making direct grants to Indian tribes to administer some federal monies and federal programs, got it started. And the Indian leadership then began to exert some power and some pressure to get, but when you think of matters in 1968, which you mentioned as a template, at that time, American Indian tribes really were only beginning to assert control over their reservations and had been thwarted over the years by states trying to intrude on them and what Bob was mentioning, to regulate matters on Indian reservations, to tax Indians on reservations, because states resented a competing or separate sovereignty in their borders. And I think the Nixon message, was key in recognizing that tribes should control their own reservations and not federal bureaucrats. There were well-meaning but usually non-Indian paternalistic bureaucrats in the Bureau of Indian Affairs that thought they knew better. Nixon reined that in. The Nixon message reined that in. It's never happened since then. We haven't had to put up with that, Bob, you and I practicing Indian law. So I'd say that's been really key.
Bobby?
I was just going to say, I remember peripherally, at any rate, discussions in the Roosevelt Room with some people from the Justice Department talking about, you want to establish an independent Indian Trust Council authority funded by the United States, which in reality will have the ability to sue the United States. We're going to fund an organization that's going to sue us. And that was a really big hurdle to get over. And I think that's one of the reasons that in the end the Vice President decided to go with the option of having an office within the Secretary of the Interior, because that was a fairly revolutionary concept at the time, I think. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't it have been?
It would have been, and I guess in a way I functioned as something like that office. But now,
but you could have been reined back in if the secretary, if somebody had wanted to rein you back in. When you have a chartered independent trust council authority, no one would have reined them back in.
Well, should that have been enacted? What are your thoughts on that with 40 years perspective?
I really don't know.
Bob, Wally, what do you think?
Well, I think it's still a controversial issue. I mean, I've mentioned it in some of our, as we've been going around and having these trust reform meetings. And, there's a view that, Interior is just going to forget about, asserting Indian interests when there's a fight with the Department of Labor or the Department of Agriculture, and they'll say, well, let that trust council bring a lawsuit. And, that's a valid concern that people share. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to get back to, linking, the modern assertion of tribal sovereignty and tribal government and the whole development of courts back to this self-determination model. Because, once tribes take over administration of programs, they need lawyers to help administer these programs, to help, deal with the amount of funds that are available, with the regulations. And once the tribes had their own lawyers, whether it was through OEO or through their own hiring them with their own funds, the tribes started to say, look, hey, this treaty guaranteed a homeland to us. That includes sovereignty. There's Supreme Court cases that say private powers persist unless and until Congress explicitly takes them away. And, and then, Wally, you alluded to this to me in private conversations of lawyers from NARP and others, aggressively, lobbying the Justice Department to assert tribal interests in the name of the United States as trustee. And this was all, I think, part of this movement that started with this message.
I speak as a panelist now. because part of the success of the Nixon message went to the nature of the people who were in the administration. Kent Frizzell, for whom Reed worked and with whom I worked, was committed to seeing a proper implementation of the fiduciary relationship we had. I can remember talking to him, what's this mean about that trust relationship? And we work it through, and I'm back on what Bobby said, do the right thing. We worked it through to do the right thing. Now, we didn't have the message in front of us and weren't reading it, and the president never talked to me, and neither did the attorney general. I worked for 8 of them. They didn't talk about this, but we understood the atmosphere within which we were working. And we worked to do the right thing. Now, Bobby points out the incredible conflict that went within making internal government decisions. And we've structured the government in such a way that they resolve those differences, but they don't make it easy. And then you have outside influences like the NARF attorneys, who had no shame in working toward the implementation of the native interests. But it's a balancing act, and it's not a very simple one.
Bob, you mentioned the Bryan case, and I want to come back to that just for a second. The Congress had passed a statute in 1953 during the era when it was trying to terminate the relationship with Indian tribes, and President Truman and President Eisenhower basically supported that. So the Nixon message seems clearly the right policy today, but it hadn't really been the policy of any president before the Johnson message in 1968.
And Johnson played at the edges of it a little bit.
Yeah, and it was at the end of his
administration. But it was a good
administration.
message, but he played at the edges, at the end of his administration.
It was a good template for
It was a
you.
good template, correct.
But I'm thinking with the Bryan case was an example where the Interior Department wanted Justice to file a friend of the court brief on the Indian side, or I wanted them to do that. And I went into a meeting with Kent Frizzell, and I said, look, this Public Law 280 is being much too broadly interpreted to really allow states to exercise full authority over Indian reservations in their states, and we need to cut it back. And Kent looked, we actually went and read the statute. He said, yeah, but look, it says here they can't do any taxes of a certain kind. Doesn't that mean they can do taxes of another kind? I remember the meeting, and I said, well, that's a perfectly reasonable position. Maybe the court comes out that way. But another way to read the statute, and a reasonable argument, is that they intended only to have court jurisdiction and only let courts resolve civil disputes. Now that sounds kind of arcane, but essentially the issue was, if the Indians have a reasonable position, and we're the trustee for the Indians, we ought to assert that position and let the court sort it out, but have the United States on the Indian side. And Kent agreed. I mean, that was the standard that he had. We sent it over to Wally, and I guess Robert Bork was the Solicitor General then. And they agreed. They filed the brief in the Supreme Court. We won the case 9-0, or the Indians won the case. It was Minnesota Legal Services. But I think that's, in terms of searching for a standard in your trust commission, I want to commend that kind of standard to you, that it's not, it used to be, before that Judge Chambers and Judge Frizzell and Judge Johnson would all sit there and think what the right answer was in terms of the law, and wouldn't take a position unless they were convinced it was right. Well, we didn't act as judges. We acted as a trustee, and I think that was that was an important template for us.
Bobby, do you have some pictures that would be relevant for the record? Or?
Yeah, I don't know when I was speaking whether anybody showed any pictures up there, and I don't know how you do
Why
this.
don't you just talk to the
But
record?
I don't know how to say it more than this. I mean, I don't think you've ever had a picture like this before or since in the White House. It was extraordinarily moving. And there was the way in which the cacique and the tribal secretary related to the president and vice versa was very personal and I think quite extraordinary. Here's a picture just before the meeting in the Oval Office with the president and the vice president and the cacique and Paul. Here is a picture of the president going around greeting the tribal council leaders, Taos Pueblo tribal council leaders in the cabinet room. And as I said, to have this in the cabinet room was quite an extraordinary honor. I mean, even when I was head of public liaison for President George Herbert Walker Bush, and that meant I dealt with all the, quote, interest groups in the country, I don't think there was more than one occasion that I was able to put them in the cabinet room with the president. Of course, you're going to say, but Indians are not an interest group. They're a sovereign nation, and indeed they were. And that was the point of what Richard Nixon was trying to show, was they were sovereign, they were nations, and they deserved the same respect, and therefore the access to the cabinet room. So just another, again, it's too small to see, but everybody's sitting around in the cabinet room. And here was Christmas time in the White House and the signing of the message. I mean, of Blue Lake, return to Blue Lake, and but the president reflected on and talked about the full Indian message, and the place was just absolutely packed. Two other things that just come up to mind that I wanted to ask Bob. I think I was incorrect in that in addition to the $1 billion, Alaska Native land claims, in addition to $1 billion, wasn't there also 2% of royalties? Or was that how you got to the $1 billion? That's how you got to the $1 billion. Okay, all right. And then the other thing, just since I have the microphone and there's cameras up there, I just want to say something about, you talked about how progressive this policy was at the time. I want you all to focus on Richard Nixon as a progressive Republican domestic president across the board. Everybody knows about China. Everybody knows about foreign policy. Ron Walker's sitting there. That's the reason President Nixon was in China. Ron Walker advanced that first trip. But take a look at the domestic arena, which nobody pays any attention to. Richard Nixon, again, 1969 to 1974, established the Environmental Protection Agency, did clean air and clean water, established the Office of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration within the Labor Department, laid the groundwork for ERISA, for major pension reform, instituted the Philadelphia Plan, which was the first affirmative action plan in the construction trades, funded the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities. Had been started under President Johnson, but had never really been funded. Huge amount of funding into that. Defining and changing Native American policy, funding historically black colleges, doing new federalism, doing revenue sharing, healthcare reform. I'm not a big fan of Obamacare. However, I will tell you, the first healthcare reform came out of Richard Nixon, HMOs. I don't know what you all think about HMOs these days, but back then that was just an extraordinarily forward-looking thing. I mean, when you take a look at all those different areas, it is quite astounding. And Richard Nixon was an extraordinarily progressive Republican president, and I think that's important to know.
And on that wonderful note, I've just been informed that it's
12,
time
not
for us to
12:30?
wrap it up. And
I think it was 12.
while all this has been a wonderful conversation, it will be a continuing conversation, because as we uncover more information and gain new insights, we intend to have other sessions like this. So I thank everyone who has been part of it, our hosts, and particularly the National Archives and the Nixon Foundation for stimulating these conversations.
Can I add just one more thing?
Of course, you
Also-
can have the last word.
Yes, welfare reform. The welfare reform that President Bill Clinton eventually passed was essentially Richard Nixon's H.R. 1 welfare reform in 1969. On that
And
note.
there you have it. Thank you.